Okay. Hi,
Welcome,
everyone.
everyone. Welcome, Caroline. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Caroline is the head of business development and commercial for Innovate Finance, the industry body for fintech in the UK. We're very happy to have you here. And without further ado, the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I bet there's a bunch of incredible brains that hopefully will look at fintech in the future on this call. If I do anything right, I hope you do at least look at it. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Caroline Vaughn. I do run what I call growth, but ultimately business development and commercial at Innovate Finance. And I'll give you a little bit of an overview of Innovate Finance. It is industry body, but by proxy of the fact that it's fintech, ideally, we remain a little bit more nimble because our sector is incredibly nimble. So our company sits in the center of the industry, representing what I call our portfolio of 250 different companies. A third of those are pure startups, and that's anywhere from an idea through to Series A, B, still getting off the ground. A third of them are Series B and above, and that category has grown over the past few years as we have seen maturity in the sector. And those are the Series B and onward, looking to scale globally, or at least in new markets. They are the rapid hiring phases. So to give you an example, Revolut very openly and in the headlines is hiring 100 people a week in the midst of COVID still. So you have huge acceleration in that segment. And I'll speak through it, but we continue to see investment into that space, contrary to some of the anecdotal feedback that the investment has dried up. The final third, I think, are worth noting, because when we say fintech, we also include these folks. It's what I would call institutional players, but that's a makeup of the asset managers, insurers, investment bank, retail banks, and then the big tech. I'll give you, and payments as well. My kind of best and brightest from those categories that work with us currently, but we have contacts into more, are the likes of BlackRock in the asset management, BlackRock Schroders. We have Visa, we have PayPal, we've got Facebook, Salesforce, and then the big retail banks that you'd imagine, so Citi, Lloyd, Santander, etc. The reason I give such a preface to that is I think this segment is always evolving, and you guys will know this as well as I will, and you'll probably have more real-time insight to it, if not similar, which is that the players in the space don't look like they did 5 years ago. And that's, I think, a testament to the space. You hear terms like embedded finance, you hear the likes of sustainability and green being included in this agenda. I alluded to insurance. Insurance would like to think that they're outside of this umbrella, but we think that they're in the umbrella of fintech. So we look to bring the right brains around the table to solve the big problems that we have at hand. And they're problems that we think require all counterparties to be at the table. So we also work very closely with what I call Fintech PLC, specifically for UK, but we do have good ties in elsewhere. And that includes the likes of Treasury, policymakers, FCA, trade and investment arms, all with an interest in ensuring that this sector continues to, I would say, continues to thrive, both in the UK and globally, but also stays ahead of it. So our job is very often to define that to the right stakeholders so that they don't create friction, or they can help amplify what we're trying to achieve. So as promised, I think I'll take you through a little bit of where we are, what we're seeing investment-wise, what the sector looks like. And I think it's important to look at the sector not just today, but take us back 6 months and look at where we've come. Primarily COVID, but a lot of stuff is based on the maturity of the sector anyway. So we made a joke earlier that the last company that came to Spoke got acquired. We've started to see a lot of M&A and different sort of activities. One could hook that to COVID, but outside of COVID, we were anticipating that. Valuations we were anticipating. So I'll get to that in a bit. But if you look here, you can look at our ecosystem. I've talked through the who, but this is the what. This is the what and why, quite frankly. So as I said, stakeholders into the government, stakeholders into regulators, capital, which is one of the key things to make this segment run. And I assume that some of you will not just look to go onto the operational side of fintech, but you'll fuel the space through ensuring that there's enough investment going into it. Skills and talent, again, this is exactly why we're having this chat, which is we want to make sure the sector is seen as, that has visibility as a all, and that we're getting the right skills and talent into the space with a true understanding of what it means to work in the space. I think you do that best by making sure that the space speaks for itself, and that you see the variety and diversity of opportunities within the segment. But we look at everything from ensuring that there's a pipeline of talent to get to where you are, i.e. going younger and younger, to open this space up. We think it's also an opportunity for social mobility to educate people on fintech opportunities from a job perspective, but also just financial products more widely. So we have something called Fintech for Schools. And then we also look at the kind of wider sector. So all the other players in the ecosystem is, quite frankly, the most overused word that I've had to use for the past 6 years, but I think it does help people understand the vastness of what it looks like, the key players that sit within it. Moving right along, as I said, I think it's important to look at not only, money talks. Let's look at that and the investment across the country here in the UK. For those following you, politics, the current administration has a good phrase, build back better, leveling up. It's a global sentiment, which is how do we get less consolidation of opportunity, particularly in the innovation economy, so that it's not purely centralized around London proper. If you're using the UK as an instance, you have to only look to France to look at Marseille versus Paris, so data versus other different hubs. And so you see this across the world. But here we think it's important that we can create pockets of opportunity across the country. So we work really closely, not just in London, but with all the other associations. And if you look, the likes of Fintech Scotland, and I bring this up because if you are looking from a next stage, Fintech Scotland has a huge grant right now from the EU to develop data and infrastructure and AI and machine learning that will come out of it. So different pockets have a lot of work with their core base, and then they have a presence in other markets. So if you look at the likes of Starling, they have a huge office for their customer service in Cardiff. If you look at, actually Cardiff is quite popular for some of that work. So it's just figuring out where you can get the best talent and then building out presence around that. And there's a lot of government support to do so. I'll move on to how we sit at the heart of the ecosystem, or how we attempt to sit at the heart of the ecosystem. And I've tapped into some of these, but I think it's worth bucketing it out to the key trends that we think transcends all of those different players with different ambitions. So capital investment, fintech hubs, government regulator, partners, and then our members. Ultimately, we're trying to communicate the needs and the opportunities across all of those. For today, I'll leave it, but I do think it's worth noting also that fintech doesn't sit in a bubble. UK can't isolate how they approach this segment. Well, France does something different and the US does something different. Ultimately, all these markets need scale. And so through the maturity, we've seen that the interoperability of, back to ecosystems, interoperability of ecosystems has heightened. You look to things like the fintech bridges that the UK government has created, or GFIN, which is the Global Financial Regulator Network, that tries to create like for like in some of the regulations so that you can scale easily into new markets. Next, as I always say money does talk. So this gives you a little bit of an investment and deal flow activity. I think the key factors here are that it is continuing to go up. The other key factor here is we're seeing bigger deals, but in a fewer deals, but more concentrated, bigger deals. Again, it comes back to the word maturity. And I think it's really important to talk about that as you look to go into the industry, which is rather than many fintechs chipping away at many opportunities, you're seeing both by pure necessity in terms of cash flow, some So if you look to the likes of RateSetter, who just sold to Metro Bank, some of that's a cash flow and a business operations due to COVID issue, but you're also seeing really interesting partnerships come out. You don't have to look any further to the States for kind of the Goldman Apple partnership that gets flaunted around regularly, but even smaller partnerships, particularly in the open banking, open data space, where fintechs and fintechs are really going to market together, adding a more bundled product. If you look at where the UK, because I know some of you aren't sitting in the UK, in a COVID world, you may be, but if you look at the kind of more wider European vantage point, you can see where we're seeing the high deal flow. I haven't even used the B word yet, so we'll get to that. But in a post-January or post-December Brexit market, we're going to see some interesting movement. And I think I want to talk about COVID, but I do think Brexit is worth noting as well, which is how companies will passport into wider Europe and what that looks like overall. But this gives you great illustrations of what the actual deal numbers are. UK continues to do really well in and amongst that. We'll see what happens going forward. Top 10 countries again in deal count and deal investment, you can see here, and I'm going to move quickly along because I actually want to get into the segments. So where is there opportunity for jobs? This is marginally out of date, but I think it reigns true. A good thing to actually for future presentations. I would love to see the news heat map in relation to this. So you get a lot of noise around digital banks, neobanks, et cetera. But in terms of opportunities and companies by verticals represented, this is where we're seeing it, particularly in the UK. The payments and remittance space, there's been some big stories, I mean, over the past year, but it is only on an upward trajectory down through, I think, things that I would like to tease out of this that we've seen come out of COVID is truly the B2B space, B2B and capital market space. It's the grown-up finance, as I'll call it, that truly realized, be it just pure workflow and operations and resiliency, but also the move to cloud. COVID really woke everybody up. It's a terrible joke, so bear with me, but it's the who created your innovation strategy? Was it your CEO? Was it your CTO? Or was it COVID? I just got off the phone with a consultant, anecdotally said most banks, call it banks for the time being, in COVID, put their heads down, absolutely. They fixed problems with people they knew, and they fixed them quickly. And yet, the big thing that they're really thinking about now is how do you sustain that, call it innovation or call it resiliency and agility to change, because as you will all know, having studied or cared about this space, when you look to big institutions, it's hard to affect change at huge scales that they need. But we have seen a huge acceleration in that. Procurement process, due diligence processes that took years, if not many, many months, went down to a month, went down to weeks. You really saw things and partnerships go through quickly. And I think we'll see the sustainability of that within the sector. I think I'm going to give you this because if I were in your position, this would be a great way to do it, which is who's out there, what do they do, what segment do they play in, and from that, we can almost do an overlay of who has money and who just went through funding rounds, et cetera. Because by proxy, that's where the opportunities really are. I threw names out like Revolut. I think the likes of Greensill, Oak North, it's those that are expanding rapidly, are flushed with cash and resource, and really are taking on a hot market, which everybody will say that that's the ultimate, which is the right company in the right segment at the right time. But I think there's quite a few companies here, and I will say just anecdotally again, how important it is to note there's a lot of hiring going on. There's a lot of hiring and there's a lot of movement. And I think that from what we're hearing, that will continue to stay the same back to the demand. And I do want to speak to the COVID piece a little bit here, which is the fintech space ultimately came about on the back of 2008. The crash and the lack of trust in the sector. Particularly in the UK, you had competition rules, which also merited more fintech growth. So you look to the likes of the non-bank lending sector or alternative lending, because we wanted the consumer to be protected. if you flash forward to now, ultimately, you've had a new demand come up, which is in the world, SMEs have taken on more debt than ever before, and oftentimes first-time SME debt holders. Individuals are the same. So there's a behavioral change embedded into that, and there's a need embedded into that. The governments in many countries have gotten involved in funding these. So in the UK, we have the Future Fund. There's underlying government debt associated now to the growth economy, the innovation economy and the growth sector rather. So we've seen a change in behavior. We've continued to see investment flow, as I said, and at the beginning of COVID, it was the kind of throwaway was concentrating on our portfolio companies, and then we'll look up once we have some air. The next thing was we want to talk with people. It's all human nature. We want to talk with people who we know before, because it's a due diligence process and it's tricky to do on Zoom. But I think the overarching theme now is good companies will get good money. And if you are in the right space, money is continuing to flow. Being aware of time, we have about 12 more minutes. And so, as I said, teasing out a little bit of the actual opportunities, B2B has exploded. Banking as a service has exploded. Anything that helps ease the efficiency of big banks. So regulation, the reg tech, all things regulation, the resiliency of operations have absolutely skyrocketed. And then I also would say you've seen the insurers, the asset managers, those that I would have called the slow to innovate actually pick up activity massively because they have, due to necessity. Sectors that haven't done as well are the non-bank lending sectors, and primarily due to the fact that government money was allocated, and when it was allocated, particularly in the UK, it went through the large institutions, and so loan books were squeezed, and kind of the trust in the segment wasn't as strong as we would have hoped. And I'm being oversimplifying here, but it is a sector that has not been able to thrive as much as it would like. And we'll see, I think, what will shake out on the back of that. Other segments, I think we'll be okay now. I'll continue on. The other thing that I would say has emerged from this is opportunities like digital identity. As I said, the next iteration of what fintech will look like. We talk about embedded finance, and that ultimately means how it transcends every industry. So how you shop, how you move around a city, etc. And I think we've seen that. The other big piece that we've seen as a trend, and I don't think this is a COVID specific by any means, is just the emergence of big tech truly into the space. So if you look to the States, you have Facebook Financial announced, you have the likes of Amazon who continue to play, have been playing in all parts of the space. Goldman, Apple Pay, Apple Card, which to those that are in Europe, frictionless payments isn't a huge novelty, but it is getting adoption more globally. I think you don't have to look further to the news cycle as well, though, just to see how hammered those big techs are getting currently, be it from the anti-monopoly cases. So we'll see how far they go into this space, but I do think it's a major trend that we're watching really closely. And then finally, it's how financial services can fuel the wider sustainability agenda from a data perspective, from a reporting perspective, but purely the financial products that will be needed in order to meet the objectives that ESG and otherwise want to achieve. Moving right along, and hopefully everybody has questions for me after. I'm going to close out. This is all my details. I'd love to chat with you about it. I mean, to get very practical and to say, if you're looking for a job, how do I get into the space? Who's hiring? Quite frankly, my number one piece of advice, there's quite a few jobs boards out there, of course, including our own. We have a jobs board that consolidates some of those jobs opportunities. But I think if you take one thing away from this session, I do always say follow the money, which is the venture portfolio websites to me are one of the best resources. It's the most up-to-date, and then following and tracking those funding alerts. So on a silly basis, follow me on LinkedIn. All of you I'll accept, of course. I put out fintech funding alerts So anytime there's a news headline about a funding round, we do that the same through our company. So please follow Innovate Finance. Please sign up for all of our non-member newsletter, because we put out all the industry-wide activities for the space. It helps create a bit of credentials. It helps create information flow. Recently, and everybody wants to get into fintech now, 6 years later, a PR company calls themselves a fintech. Everybody's in the fintech space, but from an information flow perspective, I think you're getting narrower channels, but very specific audiences. And I would urge you to follow us on Twitter, follow us on LinkedIn, etc., because the information flow and the platform for which we get people to post to our channels is quite specific. So you should capture a lot by hitting up one channel. We have podcasts because we've been living in a digital world. We usually hold the festival for fintech called UK Fintech Week once a year. This year we did it all digital. So from a learning and an opportunity to better understand different companies, please go deep into our content and resource section, which is its own little mini MBA on fintech. As simple as Coffee with InFin, where we interview most of the founders in the UK and COOs and senior leadership teams, through to the white papers we put out, the investment reports. And please keep an eye and ear out. Treasury in the UK has put out a mandate for fintech strategic review, of which we're secretary at. So around January, or kind of the end of the year, we'll be putting out a report on what we think the next chapter of this sector looks like. And we've gone very deep with most of the key stakeholders here to ask the right questions around capital unlocking, around skills and talent, and ultimately, what's the big answer to how we make sure this thrives going forward. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that gave a little bit of time for questions, and I will be quiet for once. Please, I don't know how best to do this, but anybody have questions?
Thank you very much, Caroline. I think that's already answers a lot of the question I've received in the registration form. Another question that some people have asked is, with all this growth as MBAs, right? Where could MBAs play a role in these startups? What kind of skills are they looking for? Because our MBAs come from various backgrounds. I think we have like experienced people here and there with 5-6 years of experience. What do these startups value? What kind of skills do they need?
I think I'll give you a few answers to that. One of which is it is your strategic thinking, 100%. I would redefine fintechs so as to not just bucket it as startup, because I think it's really important to illustrate the opportunity in innovating in financial services. And it sounds a bit hokey to say that, but I genuinely don't think you need to just go to a startup to be in this space and affect change. You can do it within the big banks, the high growth. So, I mean, I'm going to flip your question in a bit of a way, which is figure out what your skill sets are, and that will be needed to be really transparent, which is they need growth. They need to hit customer acquisition, be it B2C or B2B. So how do you hack growth? How do you use the most advanced digital capabilities today? They need programming, of course, but I think the programming and digital need is overplayed massively in this space. It's a highly regulated space, so to be able to construct that regulation and convert that into action, so be it, I alluded to Brexit, we're going to have a lot of companies that are going to have to quite quickly navigate how they expand through Europe now that Brexit's not the case. We've got trade negotiations going on with other countries. So you'll have to have that, and INSEAD's a perfect testament to this, which is I know how international it is by nature. Growth will have to come from being slightly global. And I think that understanding everything from language, which I think you all have to speak at least 2 languages, if not 3, everything from language, and that sounds silly, but it's not, don't underrate it. It's just the global growth they'll need, the policy driven, but also there's such rapid expansion that we talk a lot about culture. If you don't define it, it can become unwieldy. There's a lot that we say fin and tech didn't do beautifully. So if you look at diversity of the sectors, if you look at trust in the sector, especially now. So as we rebuild, do it better. To steal a bit from the UK or from the UK's Build Back Better strategy. I also think there's a lot of problems that need to be solved. I do think financial services almost benefits from people that have wider industry knowledge. As I said, these aren't going to be purely problems that financial services have solved before. So digital identity, for instance, open banking changes the playing field for this space. Payments, and then how payments will, again, back to my definition of, you could go work for Net-a-Porter and be in fintech because you are managing their payment structure. Shopify's head of payments is one of the most popular people in the space. So don't define it narrowly, is what I would say. It definitely doesn't look just like a startup. And in fact, I think a lot of the innovation in the next 5 years will come from bigger institutions. And as I alluded to very early in this call, there's going to be a consolidation in the space. So that's a wide answer to your narrow question, but your strategic thinking, your global approach, your ability to create cultures and understand dynamics of cultures that are set up from the beginning, and also just the ability to navigate very complicated spaces in real time and respond with critical thinking as opposed to sector specific ways of working.
Perfect. That sounds great. And indeed that's a very wide answer. And the next question comes from Janil Shah in the chat. How much of an impact do you feel that the UK government regulations and policies have been in helping nurture the nascent fintech startups?
Huge. As you will pick up, I'm from America. I think there's a unique component to this, one of which is the regulator's ability to foster this and foster it, but primarily the step before foster is to really understand the space and care to understand the space. I think you look to the likes of Singapore, they're doing it well. There's a few markets that have really jumped on board to this. If you look at the States, and yes, huge opportunity for customer base, but the ability to navigate state by state regulation is challenging. If you look, there's a fintech charter currently on, I think within 2 years, nobody had signed up for it. And it's because nobody wants to be in court constantly being the guinea pig of innovation. So I think for the regulator to be forward thinking has driven it. I think there's other secret ingredients, which are the regulator was forward thinking, the talent sits here to a lot of extent, particularly in the legacy of financial service and tech. The kind of wider banking meets all of the universities that are here. So there's a lot more to the secret sauce, but I think no doubt the regulator has been a huge, huge component of it. Hopefully that answered the question.
You did, yeah. And it's very good to hear that experience. There's another question on, with those fintechs in stage B of funding seeking international expansion, which markets are you seeing the large chunk of UK fintechs first trying to expand to, both within Europe and otherwise? So where are the companies expanding to? Sorry, is this my internet not working, or? Caroline, are you there? Okay, guys, seems like Caroline is having some technical issues. Let's wait for a couple of minutes. You're back. Caroline, okay.
Sorry, go ahead with that last question.
Welcome back. So the question earlier was, where is the fintechs expanding internationally from the UK?
The US, North America more broadly. I think it's seen as a double whammy, one of which historically, but it holds true, is to seek investment, but it's just such a huge market for people. So while it is incredibly complex, you are still seeing people look that direction. The other markets that I think are interesting that have, I would say, exponential growth and worth paying attention to, the likes of South America. So you look at the Brazil market, much of some of those are almost what I would call leapfrog innovation, which is, I think the stat in Mexico is 60% of customers didn't have digital banking. So there's an easy way to jump into the market where there's not a lot of competition. We're seeing massive innovation, particularly in Australia, particularly around data and open banking because of their regulation. Canada has a huge market for data, AI, and machine learning. So I think, and obviously, I say obviously, but Singapore remains quite strong in terms of how connected the government is and the ambition there to succeed. But when you look at growth from UK into other markets, I don't bring up Europe. Europe continues to be a key market for people, and UK historically pre-Brexit was the gateway into Europe. I think that will continue. It will just look different, and there'll be a period of which we'll wait to hear what that looks like. That being said, 3 years ago, a lot of companies made accommodations for it already. So, but when you look at that, it's nice to be, it's good almost to bucket Europe as a whole from that perspective. So the Netherlands has had quite a bit of growth. France obviously is a great market with a bunch of government support as well and into the sector. So my first answer, because it's so prevalent on the investment side, is the US. And there it's primarily into San Francisco and New York, but COVID has brought up a lot of reasons. If you speak to some folks out there, you're starting to see, so the likes of Stripe, who a few weeks ago made an announcement that they're paying some of their employees to move to other states because of the cost of running a business in California. What you're seeing out of California and growth into the North America market more widely is that people are doing, because we can be remote, they're having specialism. So some of the tech talent, Utah's emerged as a market because there's grants for your tech talent. Parts of Canada, you can basically run your tech talent for free because there's government grants. So you're seeing folks put parts of their organization in different parts of the country. And again, if you look to North America, the other key hubs are Chicago, a bit of Texas, but into Charlotte, North Carolina, because of the historic banking, and also Atlanta for payments.
Perfect. So it depends on the sector specifically for the fintech, and then if they're in like data, AI, machine learning, Canada might make a lot of sense to start in the Americas, and this is very interesting. And I think we're already overrunning. Do you still have time for 2 quick questions, Caroline?
Sure, of course.
We have it in the chat. The first one comes from Harsh. How well UK fintechs are placed to scale and grow internationally, given that actually you've answered this one previously. So let's go to the next one. How big is the stagnation risk for UK fintech due to Brexit?
So really good question. Hopefully I've tapped into bits of it. I will say a lot of that risk has been already baked into the system, given the fact that 3 years, like I said, 3 years ago, people looked into how they passported into Europe more widely. I think a lot of the right people are thinking about this. So it's not as though we're going into it blind. I also think by proxy of rewriting trade agreements on the back of Brexit, you'll almost rewrite new opportunities into them. So if you look to the likes of the relationship with the US, as I alluded to earlier, there's a lot of opportunity already pre-existing there. So how do we create better ways of having growth? But I do think you also have to look in parallel to the growth of the sector at the same time, which is we actually have built big companies and they've already scaled into new markets, and they've already I think what we'll really look to is what will the track be to the likes of the IPO? What will we see as these companies mature? It's not saying that the problems that we've had will go away, but I think as we move from being a pure startup nation to scale up and high growth nation, you'll see different teething pains come out of it. But I don't think it's going to be isolated to Brexit. I think Brexit is one component in the bigger kind of reevaluation, back to what I said about the review that's happening, the reevaluation of how we need to continue to thrive. And that's everything from, yes, Brexit's one of it, but how do we look at how companies have remained private for longer now? Where is liquidity going? How have the market's been affected by COVID, and how does that make investors want to go risk off from traditional equity to risk on in more private segments? So I think Brexit's a big piece, but it's not the only piece to how it will continue to thrive.
Perfect. So we'll expect there's a lot of factors playing into the market. Brexit is just one of it. Well, I believe that the UK won't stagnate that quickly just because of one factor.
And I also think, again, when it comes to Brexit, I think much of it has almost been baked into the system. Like the volatility that we had when Brexit was announced, how we've been trying to unpick it for quite a few years. As I said, I think we will have to think of a few new things, but a lot of it's already been embedded into the risk factor.
Absolutely. Right. We think we are running out of time. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you very much, Caroline, for sharing and for the knowledge. And we'll have more.
One last thing before I let you go, though.
Absolutely.
I do want to say I am open to helping, to supporting this more widely. I think please do reach. I said follow me on LinkedIn channels, etc. Follow us on all those channels, but feel free to reach out. Hopefully, we can be strategic in some of the work that we're doing together as entities. But feel free to reach out to me personally.
Zainab, you catch that?
Good. I expect to hear from a few of you.
Absolutely. Right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day ahead.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.